My name is Arthur Fleming, and I'm going to tell you about the day I walked out of Meridian Industrial Systems after 40 years. But that day, the Friday afternoon when I was told my services were no longer required, that wasn't really the day I left. It was the day my plan finally came due. Let me take you back further. I was 21 when I started at Meridian in 1984, fresh out of an associate degree program, nervous about my first day. The plant made precision aircraft components, landing gear, control actuators, hydraulic housings, parts that had to work perfectly because failure at 30,000 feet isn't an option. We weren't making replaceable consumer goods. We were making parts that kept people alive. I was hired as a junior process technician monitoring production lines. My supervisor was Tom Kellerman. He taught me why tolerance and documentation mattered. "Arthur, some guy in a fighter jet is counting on you," he'd say. I never forgot that. Over 40 years, I advanced. Shift supervisor by 1991, process engineer by 1998, director by 2008 at age 43. I wasn't at every happy hour. I understood systems, every machine on the floor, how it worked, how to maintain it, how to troubleshoot. I knew the protocols, the certifications, the regulations. This knowledge was in me in my 22 notebooks, handwritten since the early 80s. Every procedure, every specification documented. The company changed hands several times but stayed steady. Good pension, decent health insurance, profit sharing. Do your job, don't make trouble. You had security. Then, in early 2024, a private equity firm called Concord Capital made a play for Meridian. They bought a controlling stake. And within 90 days, Marcus Webb arrived as the new CEO. Marcus Webb came from a manufacturing conglomerate where he'd made a name through aggressive cost restructuring. Concord gave him a mandate: improve margins and cut costs within 3 years. Marcus brought in Daniel Park as VP of Operations, 34, fresh out of an MBA, a stint at McKinsey, no manufacturing floor experience. Daniel saw waste everywhere. His strategy: cut headcount, consolidate roles, push mandatory shifts, implement flexible scheduling so people wouldn't know their hours more than a week out. Now, I was 59 years old when Daniel Park arrived. I had 2 years until my normal retirement age of 61. I was not interested in conflict. But I also understood something fundamental. Manufacturing plants, especially ones handling aerospace components and strict certifications, don't run better with constant instability and exhausted staff. They run worse. More mistakes, more safety incidents, more liability. My contract stated 40 hours per week, Monday through Friday, with no weekend or mandatory overtime requirements. Daniel wanted to tear that up in practice, calling it a flexible working model. He started by implementing mandatory overtime on weekends, rotating. Everyone from director level down had to participate. I was technically exempt from a lot of operational details, but my department, process engineering, we had to be available when the floor was running. The first 2 times they called me in on a Saturday morning, I came. I did the work. But the third time I said no. I told Daniel that my contract didn't require Saturday work, and that my time at Meridian had always included a work-life boundary that enabled me to be sharp and effective during regular hours. I was professional about it. I wasn't hostile, but I was clear. He didn't like that. I could see it in his face. He was used to getting what he wanted from younger, more ambitious people who couldn't afford to push back. I could afford to push back. I had 4 decades of institutional knowledge and a pension vesting that nothing could touch. Over the next 6 months, the tension grew. Daniel pushed harder. More mandatory scheduling, more shift restructuring. I watched as good people left. I watched as the technical depth of the department got thinner. I watched as safety incidents ticked upward. Nothing catastrophic, but things that shouldn't have happened. Valve calibrations missed. Documentation lapses. Near misses. About 6 months before I was terminated, a colleague named Jim Kowalski pulled me aside in the parking lot after a shift. Jim worked in operations management. We'd been friendly for years, but weren't close friends. He was careful with his words. "Arthur," he said, "there's a list going around the executive conference room. Names of people they want to restructure out. I've seen your name on it. I asked him how he knew. He said he'd seen a printout, quickly, on someone's desk. The list wasn't finalized, but it was real. The timeline was unclear, but it was being discussed. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, not panicking, just thinking. I was 60 years old. I could retire now if I wanted to. My pension wouldn't be full, but it would be livable. But I also knew something else. If they fired me, especially for the reasons I suspected they'd use, there would be significant value in what they'd lose. That's when I made a decision. I was going to prepare for the day they asked me to leave, and I was going to make sure that day was extremely expensive for them. Over the next 6 months, I worked my plan methodically, like every project I'd managed in 40 years. The first thing I did was register Fleming Process Consulting, LLC, with the state of Ohio. I filed the paperwork myself, online, on a Saturday morning in late March. It cost me $87 for the filing fee, another $30 for the EIN number. I got the approval document back within a week. I then opened a business bank account at my local branch of Fifth Third Bank. Told the banker it was a consulting business, which was technically true, even if not yet active. This took me about 3 hours of a Saturday afternoon. The banker didn't ask many questions. Small businesses starting all the time, especially in the Midwest. People know entrepreneurship. I walked out with a business checking account and a debit card. I was now a legal entity. Fleming Process Consulting, LLC, established March 2024. EIN 84-472-1349. That number became very important to me. The second thing was the notebooks. I had 22 of them. Spiral-bound, leather-covered, handwritten. I've kept process notes since 1984, over 40 years. Every procedure, every system specification, every calibration, every troubleshooting method I'd learned, all handwritten in my own hand. The thing about these notebooks was, they were legally mine. I wrote them. I bought them with my own money. I maintained them outside of company time, mostly. The company never asked to see them. They existed in a legal gray area that actually favored me. There was no work-made-for-hire claim because they were my personal notes, my personal system, my personal property. I was the sole author and owner of my own engineering records. Starting in April, I photographed every page of all 22 notebooks on my personal phone. I transcribed procedures into a digital document organized by system. Line 1-4 operations, utilities, calibration, emergency protocols, vendor specs, customer requirements. Everything cross-referenced, indexed. I bought an external drive and created a master archive. It was all technically mine. Personal equipment, personal time, personal records. I owned the copyright to my own notes. I spent 6 to 8 hours a week for 6 months on this. Evenings, Sunday afternoons. The archive was comprehensive and organized. If someone needed the emergency restart for line 4, the specification tolerances for Aerotech parts, the calibration sequence for the lathe, it was all there. Not just procedures, the why behind them, the history, the lessons learned. 40 years of institutional knowledge, digitized and backed up. The third thing, and this was the critical piece, the one that actually held all the leverage, was understanding the regulatory framework. This was the piece that most business school types like Daniel Park simply didn't understand. And it was the piece that made the entire strategy work. Now, most people who aren't in aerospace manufacturing don't think much about certifications, but certifications are everything in this industry. They're not bureaucratic formalities or paperwork exercises. They're the legal and regulatory foundation that allows you to exist as a manufacturer. Without them, you can't legally produce aerospace components. Without them, no customer will buy your products because their insurance won't cover them. Without them, you don't just lose revenue. You cease to exist as a business. Without them, you're shut down. Your lines go silent. Your customers find other suppliers. You might never recover. Meridian operated under 3 primary certifications. ISO 9001, which is General Quality Management, AS9100, which is aerospace specific, and various OSHA protocols for specific hazard areas. All of these certifications came with regulatory requirements, and one of the most important requirements was the named responsible engineer. That's me, or it was, until that Friday. The named responsible engineer is not just a title, it's a legally binding designation. Your name goes on official certification documents. Your signature is on the filings submitted to the certification body, the independent third-party auditors who validate that the company meets all standards. You are the single point of technical authority for all process decisions related to the manufacturing of certified components. If there's a safety incident, a quality issue, or a process change, the named responsible engineer is on the paperwork. I had been the named responsible engineer at Meridian since 2012, 12 years. My signature was on every renewal. My name was in every audit report. My certification was what allowed Meridian to legally manufacture and ship aircraft components. And here's what nobody at executive level, nobody, seemed to understand. There was no succession plan. There was no backup. There was no other person at the company who could legally assume that role. You can't just promote someone into that position. They have to have the background, the credentials, the experience, and they have to go through a formal qualification and approval process with the certification body. It takes months. It costs tens of thousands of dollars. Daniel Park didn't know this. Marcus Webb, I suspect he didn't really care because his focus was quarterly earnings, not regulatory dependencies. And I kept my mouth shut. I never said, "Hey, you might want to think about this before you fire your process engineering director." I never raised it in a meeting. I documented everything privately, but I stayed silent. What I actually did was research exactly what would happen if I left. I read the certification standards. I reviewed the audit protocols. I called the certification body once under the guise of asking about a standard question, and I asked, hypothetically, what happened to a company's certification status if the named responsible engineer departed? The answer was clear. The certification went into a suspension state, pending the identification and qualification of a replacement. Until that replacement was in place and approved, the company could not legally ship certified components. For Meridian, that was lethal. 98% of their revenue came from certified aerospace products. No certification, no revenue. No shipping. No customer deliveries. And I also understood something else about the business that most people in the executive suite didn't focus on enough. Meridian had 3 major customers who accounted for approximately 70% of total revenue. Aerotech Systems, about 28% of revenue. Continental Automotive, about 22% of revenue. And a Tier 2 supplier network that fed into Lockheed Martin contracts, about 20% of revenue. The remaining 30% came from smaller transactional customers and custom work. But those top 3? They were the lifeblood of the company. All 3 customers had complex, highly customized specifications. All 3 had been worked on extensively during my 40 years. All 3 had critical technical relationships that existed because those companies trusted Meridian's process engineering capability, which in practical terms meant they trusted me. They knew that if they had a problem, they could call me. They knew their parts would work. They knew the quality was sound. And they understood at some level that much of that confidence flowed through one person, the director of process engineering. So I did something that I'm actually quite proud of. During those 6 months, I reached out to each of them, not through email, not formally, not in writing where there would be a paper trail, just phone calls arranged through my personal connections built up over 4 decades. I called Richard Dalton at Aerotech Systems in June. I got his personal line through the receptionist. "Hi, this is Arthur Fleming from Meridian. I need to talk to Richard about a custom spec issue." And when he picked up, I didn't waste time. "Richard, this is Arthur Fleming. I'm calling you on a private matter. I wanted to reach out about something confidential. There's a possibility that I might be transitioning out of Meridian in the not-too-distant future. And I wanted to see, hypothetically, if you'd ever be interested in a consulting arrangement with me directly, just for your own contingency planning." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what that would entail. I told him, maintaining continuity on the technical specifications and custom work you have with us, being available for troubleshooting on your end, providing documentation and knowledge transfer. Basically, if there was ever a transition at Meridian, you'd have someone who understood your requirements intimately. He said, "That's interesting. Arthur, what would something like that cost?" I told him I'd be operating under Fleming Process Consulting LLC, and my rate would be $425 per hour for consultation, with a minimum monthly retainer of $15,000 for ongoing availability. External engineering consulting firms charge $600 to $900 per hour for aerospace work. A 6-month emergency engagement costs $300,000 to $400,000 minimum. My rate of $425 per hour was much more reasonable. The $15,000 monthly retainer was a fraction of external firm costs or the cost of production disruption. Richard didn't commit to anything, but he didn't decline. He said, "I'd definitely keep that in mind, Arthur. If something changes with your situation, let me know. We'd want to explore that." I did the same with Sarah Chen at Continental in July. She was the procurement manager, and she'd worked with me on custom specifications for brake assembly components. Same conversation. $425 an hour, $15,000 a month retainer, Fleming Process Consulting, LLC. She had the same reaction. "That's really interesting. Yes, if your situation changes, definitely reach out." And the third contact, with a technical director at one of the Tier 2 suppliers that fed into the Lockheed Martin supply chain. Same script. Same opening. Same numbers. Same gentle understanding that this was hypothetical, but worth keeping in mind. All three of them walked away from those conversations with the same understanding. If Arthur Fleming ever left Meridian, they could hire him as a consultant at a very reasonable rate, and he would provide value that would cost them significantly more if they had to source it externally. More importantly, they understood that I was serious. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't desperate. I had a plan. The last piece of my preparation was documentation. I created a timeline. I documented every instance where Daniel Park had pushed for mandatory scheduling outside my contract terms. Every date. Every conversation. I wrote it all down. I wasn't being paranoid, I was being precise. If I needed to challenge the legal basis of my termination, I wanted the facts on my side. And I did one more thing. I consulted an attorney. Just one meeting, on my own time, at my own cost. About 50 minutes on the phone with a labor lawyer. I asked him a hypothetical question. If I was terminated for failure to demonstrate flexibility with scheduling requirements, but my employment contract didn't actually require that flexibility, what would my legal position be? He told me it was a weak termination cause. It was the kind of thing that could be challenged. But more importantly, he said, if I were you, I'd focus less on fighting the termination and more on documenting what value you have that they can't replace. That's your leverage. That advice crystallized what I was already doing. Everything was ready. The business was registered, the knowledge digitized, the customers primed, the legal position understood. I'd been building my insurance policy for 6 months. Then came the Friday afternoon in October 18th to be exact, when Jim called me and said, "Arthur, it's happening." He didn't have specifics, but he'd heard from someone in HR that they were going to bring me in on Friday for a termination meeting. They'd have Marcus Webb and Daniel Park there. HR would be present. I asked him if he was sure. He said, "I'm sure." We didn't talk longer than that. We both understood what it meant. That was a Friday. The meeting was scheduled for 2:15 p.m. I knew the moment the calendar hit that date, this was the end game. 40 years, and it all came down to a conference room and a separation agreement waiting on the table. I showed up that morning like any other day. I wore a button-down shirt and my regular work pants. I did some emails. I had lunch at my desk. At 2:10 p.m., Jim came by and gave me a slight nod. I walked down to the executive conference room. Marcus and Daniel were sitting on one side of the table. A woman from HR was on the other side. They asked me to sit. Marcus did most of the talking, which made sense. He was the CEO. He was cordial in tone, which made it worse in a way. He said that Meridian was undergoing a significant operational restructuring. They were moving to a new shift model, a new staffing structure, a new scheduling system. This required a level of flexibility that, after careful review of my employment contract and my performance over recent months, they didn't believe I was demonstrating. He said, "We're going to have to let you go. We're offering you a severance package, 3 months' pay, continuation of health insurance through the end of the year. We'd like you to sign this separation agreement." The document was there, already printed, already prepared, waiting for my signature. I looked at it. I didn't sign it. I said, "I appreciate the offer, Marcus, but I'm going to want to review this with an attorney before I sign anything." Daniel Park didn't like that. I could see his jaw tighten, but Marcus nodded. "Of course. You have a week to review it. We'll need your badge and laptop today, though. We've prepared a box for your personal belongings." And just like that, it was happening. 40 years was being dissolved in a 15-minute conversation. HR went through the exit process. I left my laptop on the conference table. I walked back to my office and put my personal items in the cardboard box they'd provided. A photo of my wife, Jennifer, a clock my daughter had given me, a few engineering references I'd kept. The box was small. 40 years doesn't take much space to pack. Jim walked me to the parking lot. We didn't talk much. He just said, "Good luck, Arthur." He knew something. He'd seen something in me months ago that suggested I wasn't going to be surprised by this. I put the box in the trunk of my car. I drove home. By Monday morning, October 21st, 2024, I was up at 6:30 a.m. as usual, before the alarm I'd set just in case. I made coffee, dark roast, black, in my regular cup. I sat at my kitchen table with the morning sun coming through the kitchen window, and I watched the local news on my phone. Completely normal morning. No anxiety, no dread, no sense of desperation or panic. Just a man waiting for his phone to ring, knowing with certainty that it would. I'd been fired on a Friday. It was now Monday morning. The weekend had been quiet, methodical. And now the business day was starting, and somewhere at Meridian, someone was discovering that the problem they'd created couldn't be solved without me. At 7:14 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID said, "Meridian Industrial Systems." It was Jim Kowalski, his voice tense and slightly panicked. "Arthur, don't come in. There's a situation." He paused. I could hear the background noise of the plant, machinery, voices, the sound of a facility trying to operate without its director. Line 4 went down over the weekend. The control system crashed completely. The backup initialization sequence failed. The weekend crew tried to restart it using the emergency protocol we have on the procedure sheets, but the protocol references sub-procedure 7C. That's the auxiliary servo alignment sequence. Nobody on the weekend crew knows how to execute that. The line is still down. We have electrical power to the control panel, but no hydraulic flow on the primary actuator. The system won't initialize. I listened. I didn't respond immediately. I let him talk because I wanted to hear how bad it actually was. I let that sink in for a moment. I already knew how bad it was, but I wanted to hear Jim say it. Line 4 was Meridian's main production line, the primary manufacturing asset. It accounted for roughly 40% of daily output. It was the line we ran full-time, the line we prioritized for the big customers. Aerotech had a delivery scheduled for Wednesday, 75 precision housings that their customer was counting on. Continental had components waiting in queue on that line, parts they needed for a customer delivery on Thursday. This wasn't a single-day problem. This was a revenue problem. This was a customer confidence problem. "How bad?" I asked calmly. "Bad. Marcus got a call from Richard Dalton at Aerotech at 6:30 this morning. Richard's company has a customer delivery that depends on those parts. Richard told Marcus this is a critical situation. They're asking if we can get back online today." "Can't Daniel figure it out?" I asked, knowing the answer. Jim laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Daniel doesn't know the difference between a servo and a salami. We don't even know where the printed procedures are. Everything's on your old laptop, which they took on Friday." That was the thing. The official documentation at Meridian was scattered, outdated, and incomplete. The real procedures, the ones that actually worked, the ones that reflected how the systems had been modified over years of operational experience, those were in my notebooks and in my digital archive, and definitely not accessible to anyone at the plant right now. "So what do you want from me?" I asked, though I knew. "We want you to come in and fix it." "Jim," I said carefully. "I was fired on Friday. I don't work there anymore." There was a long silence. Then Jim said, "Yeah, I know, but Marcus needs the line back online. Will you come help us?" I said, "Let me think about that. I'll call you back." I hung up and smiled. I actually smiled. This was it. This was the exact scenario I'd anticipated. The company was in a crisis that only I could solve, and they'd already fired me before realizing they needed me. They'd moved too fast. Daniel had pushed too hard. They'd cut the thread before understanding what had held together. I didn't call back immediately. I wanted to let the pressure build slightly. I wanted them to understand the depth of the problem before I offered the solution. So instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the engagement letter I drafted months ago. Fleming Process Consulting, LLC. Emergency Technical Consulting Engagement. Restoration of primary production line to operational status. Process engineering consultation. Compliance and certification support. Rate, $425 per hour. Minimum engagement, 6 months, $15,000 per month. Payment terms, net 15 days from invoice date. I reviewed the document once more. It was tight. It was fair. It was also non-negotiable. I poured myself another cup of coffee. At 8:47 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Marcus Webb, the CEO himself. "Arthur," he said, and I could hear the stress in his voice. "We have a production emergency. We need your help." I was calm. I was professional. I was warm even. "Marcus, I appreciate you calling. I do have a consulting structure in place. Fleming Process Consulting, LLC. I'd be happy to help you resolve this, but it would need to be under a formal consulting arrangement. I can have my firm's engagement letter to you by noon." He paused. "What would that cost?" $425 per hour, with a minimum monthly retainer of $15,000. I could almost hear him calculating. 6 hours to fix the line would be $2,550, but if they needed me for months, and he was starting to understand that they might, it would be $90,000 over 6 months. "And if we just want you to fix this one issue?" "Minimum 6-month retainer. The work is too specialized. I need the security of knowing I'm not going to be hired for one day and then abandoned again. Plus, given that I'm the named responsible engineer on your certifications, you're probably going to need me for other things too." I heard him inhale. I think that's when it hit him. The thing about the named responsible engineer. The thing about the certifications. "Let me call you back," he said. I said, "Marcus, one more thing. You should probably know that the certification audit is happening today. The annual recertification audit. They're probably going to show up this morning. And when they discover that the named responsible engineer is no longer employed by the company, they're going to pause the audit pending clarification of the certification chain. You might want to think about how to manage that." "Jesus Christ," he said quietly. "I'll have the engagement letter ready when you call back," I said. I hung up. I poured another cup of coffee. I opened Word on my laptop and filled in the formal engagement letter I'd drafted months earlier. Fleming Process Consulting, LLC. Client. Meridian Industrial Systems. Scope of work. Process engineering consultation. Emergency production support. Certification compliance support. Ongoing technical documentation and knowledge transfer. Rate, $425 per hour, $15,000 per month minimum retainer, 6-month initial term. I signed it. I printed it. I set it aside. At 9:15 a.m., my phone rang again. "Jim." "Arthur, the certification auditors just arrived. They're looking for you. They want to know where the named responsible engineer is. HR is telling them you no longer work here. They're saying they need to suspend the audit." Yes, I said, that's what happens when the named responsible engineer leaves the company without a qualified replacement. It's in the standards. Can you come in and help us with the auditors? I'll need that consulting contract signed first, Jim, but yes, I can help. I can help with all of it. The line, the certification, everything. I'm uniquely qualified to solve all three problems. At 9:47 a.m., Marcus called back. Arthur, I'm looking at your engagement letter. 90,000 for 6 months it's a lot of money. Marcus, let me give you some context. A typical external engineering consulting firm would charge you $600 to $800 per hour for aerospace expertise. A 6-month emergency engagement would run you $300,000 to $400,000 minimum. My rate is much more reasonable. And more importantly, I already know your systems. I already know your customers. I can integrate immediately. An external firm would take weeks just to understand what you do. He was quiet. Also, I continued, without the named responsible engineer on staff or under contract, your certifications are suspended. You cannot legally ship aerospace components, not one unit. Your entire revenue stream is down. Aerotech is already calling. Continental will be calling soon. How much would it cost you to lose 3 days of revenue? A week? A month? He took a breath. I'll sign the engagement letter. Email it back to me. Once I have signed authorization from you or your CFO, I can come in and we can resolve the production issue, manage the certification audit, and establish the consulting arrangement. At 10:23 a.m., I received an email from Meridian's CFO with the signed engagement letter. The signature was slightly pixelated from a scanned document, but it was valid. Fleming Process Consulting, LLC was now formally engaged with Meridian Industrial Systems, effective immediately. I got in my car and drove to Meridian for the first time since Friday. I was no longer an employee. I was a consultant. When I arrived at the plant, I went directly to the production floor without checking in at the main office. I wanted to see the actual problem before talking to anyone. The Line 4 control panel was sitting dark and inactive. The hydraulic system was pressurized but not cycling. I could hear the hum of the pump, but the lines weren't flowing. The display was showing a fault code I recognized. Auxiliary servo feedback loop uninitialized. I could see the problem immediately. The servo control alignment was off. Sub-procedure 7C, the procedure I documented in my personal notebooks 40 years ago and refined over the decades, required a very specific sequence. You had to reset the master servo using the manual valve on the right side of the panel, initialize the auxiliary feedback loop by cycling the pressure accumulator, and then execute a calibration sequence using manual valve inputs to establish the baseline hydraulic pressure. It sounds complex. It was complex. But it was also a 5-minute procedure if you knew what you were doing. And nobody at Meridian currently did. Daniel Park was standing near the control panel when I arrived. He looked confused and slightly panicked. I didn't address him. I just went to work. I walked through sub-procedure 7C methodically. I reset the master servo. I cycled the accumulator. I opened the calibration valves in the correct sequence. I watched the pressure gauges as they responded. 3 minutes and 40 seconds into the procedure, the auxiliary feedback loop came alive. The control panel display flickered and then showed green status lights. The hydraulic pump engaged. The pressure started flowing through the actuator lines. The primary actuators moved smoothly, testing their full range of motion. Line 4 was live. 20 minutes after I'd arrived at the plant, the time including parking, walking to the floor, and the actual procedure, Line 4 was operational. The display showed full system pressure. The conveyor started moving. The machine was ready to run. Daniel Park was staring at me. I didn't say anything to him. I just turned and headed upstairs. Then I went upstairs to the conference room where the certification auditors were waiting with Marcus. The lead auditor was a woman named Dr. Sarah Reeves from the certification body. She was professional and concerned. "Mr. Fleming," she said, "we're in a bit of a situation here. Our standards require a continuously employed or contracted named responsible engineer. The company has just informed me that you were terminated on Friday. We need to understand how you're now part of the certification chain. I sat down and explained the consulting arrangement. Dr. Reeves asked to see the contract. I pulled it out and showed her. She reviewed it carefully. So you're engaged as a consulting firm to provide process engineering support. That's correct. Fleming Process Consulting, LLC is contracted to provide expertise on all process engineering matters, including certification, maintenance, and compliance oversight. She looked at Marcus. Is that your understanding? Yes, Marcus said. Arthur's firm is now our consulting partner for process engineering. Dr. Reeves nodded. I see. Well, that's acceptable under the standards. A named responsible engineer can be a representative of a consulting firm that's formally contracted. We'll need to update the certification to show Fleming Process Consulting, LLC as the named responsible engineer entity, with you as the principal. And we'll need to update your liability insurance documentation. But yes, this works. We can continue the audit. The audit was completed by 2:30 p.m. that afternoon. 0 deficiencies. Everything was in compliance. By 3:15 p.m., my phone started ringing with the 3 customers. Richard Dalton from Aerotech called at 3:22 p.m. Arthur, I heard you were no longer with Meridian. Are you available to discuss that consulting arrangement we talked about? I am, I said. Fleming Process Consulting, LLC. $425 per hour, $15,000 monthly retainer. I've actually just started working with Meridian in that capacity as well, so I can maintain continuity with your work. Can you send me an engagement letter? I'll have one to you by email within an hour. Sarah Chen from Continental called at 3:41 p.m. Same conversation, same numbers, same agreement. The Lockheed supplier contact called at 4:09 p.m. Same result. By 4:45 p.m. I had 3 signed engagement letters, 3 customers, 3 $15,000 monthly retainers, plus the Meridian retainer I'd already locked in. That's $60,000 per month in committed revenue from retainers alone. $360,000 over the 6-month minimum terms just from retainers. Additional work at $425 per hour would be on top of that. I closed my laptop at 5:17 p.m. I took my dog for a walk. I came home and made dinner with Jennifer. We sat on the back porch and watched the sunset over the Midwest. I took a sip of my coffee. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate loudly. I just felt a quiet, deep satisfaction. This was what preparation looked like when it met opportunity. On Monday evening, sitting on my back porch, I felt something I hadn't felt in years as an employee. I felt secure. Not financially secure, though that helped. Secure in knowing that I had been right, that my knowledge mattered, that my preparation had worked, that I had control over my own future in a way I hadn't realized until it was tested. And I smiled. Not with spite, just with the quiet satisfaction of a plan that came together exactly as designed.